Hi guys, and welcome back to Photoshop Techniques for Web Designers. I'm Ben Gribbin, and today we are going to look at how to create and add textures effectively to the background of our designs. So let's go ahead and switch over to Photoshop, and let's open up we're going to start with a blank document. And what we're going to do firstly is we're going to show you how to work with textures as your backgrounds. So let's open up let's open up our course design. I don't think you'll have seen this just yet. This is going to be our demonstration design. We'll be able to show you all the techniques on the actual design itself. We're going to be changing it in some of the later sections, but first we're just going to show you some of the ways you can work with textures. Now you can see this design has got a very subtle texture in the background. And the texture itself, very simple. It's just a grungy concrete. I think it was painted, so it had like flecks of paint that were cracking off, and it looked really cool. And all we did was we loaded that into Photoshop, and then we applied the process that we're about to show you. So we're going to show you with a very slightly different file now. We'll just go ahead and open up that. So this is similar to the one that we used, not the exact texture. And what you're going to be looking for here is, we're not going to use this as a seamless texture, which we will show you how to do in one of the future lessons in this course. What we're going to do is we're just going to lay into the background, and this could be added very simply in CSS to the background of our design, and it will fade out. I think we've faded it out somewhere halfway down the page. So all we're going to do is we're going to open up our texture, and you'll notice this looks radically different to the design that we've just shown you. So what did we do to create that kind of simple, almost like a paint splatter, grunge effect? Well, all we did was we got this kind of texture, and then we played around with things like the adjustments settings, so things like curves, contrast, levels, which we're going to show you to do in a moment. Then what we did was we tweaked the blending modes. Now don't worry if you don't know what any of these are, we'll discuss what they do shortly. Now finding textures like these are very simple. There are websites such as graphicriver.net, websites such as lostandtaken.com, and these sites have got some really great free and paid textures basically that you can use in your designs. You can add detailing and interest to boring backgrounds, large areas of white space, that kind of thing. So the first thing we're going to do is desaturate the layer, because we want a nice simple background. We don't want any additional unnecessary detailing like colours. So you can see here it's gone to a nice black and white image. And then what we're going to literally do is, using levels and brightness and contrast, we're going to try and blow out the shadowy areas in this one because of the effect we were after. Obviously, you're not always going to want to do this. You might want to create a darker image. So that's fine. And if we work on removing the midtones in particular on this image, we're going to get a nice simple black and white splattered effect. So you can see very quickly we've gone from a colour stone texture to a very grungy, rough looking pattern. Then what we did was we inverted it. So if you press Command and I on your keyboard, or Control and I if you're on Windows, that will then invert the colours, so black becomes white, white becomes black, and any other colours become direct opposites of themselves. So then we've got this nice pattern that we can now use in the background of a design. So to do that, all you need to do, select the image, copy it, go over to your design document, and then we should really name all these layers, which we will do before the next lesson. So let's just remove the background that we already had in there, and you can see already that design now looks a little bit flat and also quite clean and modern. And because of the content of the design, it's a guitar website, we want it to be a bit grungy, a bit rocky and a bit cool. So just adding that little texture there really does transform a design. So we'll create a new layer and we'll paste that in. Might take a little bit of editing, a little bit of tweaking, particularly the sizing of this one. And because it's so large, if you were going to do a whole web page with this pattern on, you'd probably want to do a seamless texture, which we'll show you how to do very soon. But this is just something we want on our home page. We want to add a little bit of detail and interest to the background, only half the page, so it wouldn't take too many resources up when you were loading this on a web server, for example. So you can see this is a little bit strong, a little bit too much. It's affecting the contrast and the legibility of the page, so we do need to tweak that. And we're going to use things called blending modes, which hopefully you've heard of, but if not, we'll discuss them briefly. And also we're going to change the opacity and play around till it looks good. So blending modes then, if you don't know what they are ways that Photoshop can actually render layers slightly differently. It can adjust the way the colours interact with colours below it. It can interact differently with layers below it. And the normal setting is called normal. That's the default setting for a solid, completely normally rendered layer. Generally, you're going to use mostly darken, multiply, lighten, screen, color dodge, and overlay. So we'll show you what those are. Also, hard light, things like that, hard and soft lights, those ones are quite useful. They're all useful to some extent, but those are the ones that mainly we use personally. So we've got it on normal mode now. Let's put it onto darken and show you what that does. You can see there it's removed all of the, let's put it back to normal, it's removed all those white sections and it's actually darkened up that image. I think it's the midtones that it's kept from when we actually created this. So it's kept the midtones, and what it does is it searches the layer below, which is just a plain like dark grey background file, for darker pixels or darker options than the top one, and always uses them where it can. So now you can see it's actually just adding dark over the grey, and it's keeping these areas transparent. So that's what that does. Then multiply, if we put it onto that, multiply combines the darkness of the lower layer with the darkness of the upper layer, whilst white areas become see-through. So the white areas on our transparent image, or the texture there, have become see-through. If we invert that just very quickly, you can see what that actually does a little bit better. You can see there the black areas there, when we invert it, the colours become white and therefore they become see-through, so we can have like a black grunge applied to that. And this is all just using that original texture file that we had. Then also lighten. Now that does the opposite of darken. It compares the layers below for darker areas and uses them where it can, and black becomes see-through. No part of the image will become darker with that blending mode on. Overlay multiplies the light colours, and then it also tweaks the dark colours as well. So let's look at the normal, then let's look at multiply, and it just essentially tones down your image a little bit more. And finally, if we look at hard light's going to be a good one for this background in particular, because it just increases the contrast, makes the colours here really strong and punchy. And then if we were to change the opacity of this graphic layer now, we can actually tone it down, blend it in with our background. Now it's got a bit of a funny colour there, so let's play about with the blending modes. Sometimes that's what it takes. You have to just tweak around with blending modes, particularly when using different textures, when you're using different styles. You're going to have to play around with the kind of techniques we've discussed here. You might not even want to, in the first place, adjust the contrast and things like that of your original texture, so that's fine. I'm quite liking, if we invert the image, I liked I think it was overlay when it was inverted, something like that. And then of course we're adjusting the actual opacity there and adjusting that till we are happy with it. So that's how we'd add the background. Then at the bottom, just do a simple feather, so we can feather that out. Just make sure we're on that layer, feather out that layer, and that will create a nice smooth transition to the plain background. So that's how you would add textures to your document to add detail. Now obviously you will know how to do that to shapes and things. Now doing that to shapes, to buttons, anything like that is the same process. You just need to make sure you mask out or cut out the area around and trim the texture as appropriate. Now one final thing on adding textures to your designs, you need to make sure it doesn't affect the legibility of the document, because before we did this, if we put it to normal, or in fact if we put it to normal full opacity, and if we inverse the texture there, in areas it can affect the legibility of the text we have. Not too bad in some areas, but here you can see that line there is becoming almost unreadable, so do look out for that, especially when using things like grunge layers. It just makes the background more busy, can be a little bit distracting, so bear that in mind when you are incorporating textures into your designs. Okay, so we're going to show you another technique now that you can use to create more customizable and editable background textures, and how you can add them to buttons and shapes and all kinds of things. So the original texture we have here is the same as the one we've just shown you. It is essentially just a photograph that's been tweaked to adjust the contrast. We've changed the overlay or the blending mode to Lighten, and then we've dropped down the opacity a little bit. So that's fine, that works quite well. However, when we then want to move this and adjust this, if we were to make our canvas wider, or we wanted to resize it, for example, we can't really do that because it is limited size. That said, we can actually use a slightly different technique to create a bit more of or to retain the editability of our texture. And we're going to do that by using a pattern overlay. So what we're going to do is we're just going to make a very quick pattern using a grass texture that we have here. It's not going to be seamless, we'll show you how to do that very soon. All we need to do is go to Edit and Define Pattern. We'll just call it Pattern, press OK. Now that's made the pattern for us. We can then go into the background layer, and if we go onto the layer styles and go to pattern overlay, you'll see it adds that awful bubble Photoshop overlay rubbish kind of pattern. But we have created the grass one here, so let's just select that. So that's fine, that adds a pattern overlay to the background. Obviously it's not very content appropriate, but now what we can do, should we wish to do so, is we can actually move this around by just dragging it around, and you'll see it keeps on going and going and going and going because it's self-repeating. So if you were to actually have made this as a seamless texture, it would look pretty good, and also it offers a lot more adjustability for when you are designing. And you can actually change the scale of it, which is slightly different from the original that we used, just that simple layer. You can actually scale it down but still keep this adjustability where you can move it around, so that's quite handy. And also you can scale it up, that will blur out once it gets beyond the physical size of the texture used, but you can see that is a much easier way of being able to work with patterns. It also keeps your layers nice and organized, so that's a handy little technique to use when you are working along with textures and patterns on your background. So we've discussed in this lesson how we can use blending modes to add subtle textures, contrasty textures, and different styles to our background, and how we can also adjust those to suit the style of our design. And next time on Photoshop Techniques for Web Designers, we're going to cover page design and build backgrounds, pixel patterns and transparency. Thanks for listening.